By the time that you listen to this, I will have already released my book, Permission to Be. I'm recording this a couple of days before, so I know it's not quite out yet. But by the time this is released, so is my book on Amazon. And I thought what I would do today for this episode is sort of talk about the evolution of the book because it has been such a long journey, not just in my own healing and embodiment path, but in writing the book as well. Like the book has shifted forms so many times over the years that I wanted to share the evolution with you because it's kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting to see how this entire book was shaped by my own growth journey, by my own evolution. There were many times where I started and stopped over the years. And so I kind of wanted to walk you through the whole journey. So the first time I had the idea of writing this book came after my marriage ended. And for those who don't know, I was married to somebody who struggled with addiction issues for years. When we met, he was sober. He was in active recovery. And then at some point along the way, the stress of life, he fell into relapse. And I probably went through a 2 to 3 year up and down experience with him from, relapse to rehab to jail and all of the things in between. As I was moving through all those experiences, I found that there was very little resources for people who, were in love with those that struggle with addiction. It was actually this that inspired my book. I wanted to write about my experiences uh, with addiction, being on like the other side, witnessing somebody with addiction, what my experience was like, and offering, providing more resources for support. And this was actually what fueled my desire to get my master's degree was to ultimately I wanted to work in the addiction space and in with families because they always say addiction is a family disease and I agree it is. At the time I label it enabling, but I've come to now understand that a lot of it is tied to self-abandonment. But that was my original focus. I wanted to write a book about codependency, codependent beliefs, addiction, and all of the things. Now, at the same time, in terms of my own healing journey, I had started doing inner child work and boundary work, and I understood, the baseline of codependency and all of those things. But I did not start writing my book yet. I think that's important to note. I didn't start writing it. It was just an idea, just a concept. 2 years after my marriage ended, I got into another relationship. And this is the relationship that sort of like catapulted my whole online presence. I, now understood that that relationship was abusive, emotionally abusive, psychologically abusive. And, I understand that for a lot of people, there, it ends there. But for me, because I had already done inner child work and boundary work, I started to look at how I fell into that type of relationship, having that understanding that I already knew. And so that's when I started to notice, in myself, over functioning and people pleasing and things like that. A lot of people will say, well, the abuser did that. But because I already had the foundation of inner child work and recognizing in myself the same patterns in other relationships, especially my, relationship with my husband, I knew that that wasn't true. I knew that, my experience in that abusive relationship was not the result of him. It was the result of my own unconscious, unintegrated beliefs around my worth and all of the things. And so at some point, I want to say towards the very end of our relationship, we had broken up and gotten back together. And in the space of the breakup, I really started to get into things like spirituality. I took a Reiki course. I started to learn about energy and about emotions as energy. Um, and so then when we got back together for a brief amount of time, maybe 3 months before all of the same patterns started to come back in. But when we got back together, I started to write the book. And I remember writing the introduction and I flew right through it. And then I came to a stall. And that's when I recognized that the patterns that I was writing about, the people pleasing, the over functioning, the poor boundaries, I was still living them. Like I was living them in the relationship that I was currently in. And I remember that big aha moment, that big realization. And I remember thinking to myself, you're such a hypocrite. Like, how are you going to write a book about overcoming self abandonment when you still self abandon? So when that relationship ended, because it had to, it had to end. Um, so after that relationship ended, I really dove into spirituality. I had this big ass spiritual awakening. I started to recognize, I started to understand abuse and abuse dynamics and all of the things. And I recognized how the same patterns of, coercion and hierarchy and power imbalances exist within so many systems within our society. And I learned about the systems of oppression. I learned about the matrix of conditioning. And I think the most important thing for me in my own growth journey was understanding how all of these systems participated in the way I was conditioned to self abandon. I I remember when I did the inner child work after my marriage ended. I mean, I did the work, but it didn't resonate with me fully because I didn't perceive myself to have had a traumatic childhood. I didn't perceive there was no abuse in my childhood, there was no neglect. But there was a lot of socially conditioned beliefs that had me learn to self abandon. Everything about the way I learned to show up in relationships was programmed. And so the call for me to write this book got even louder because I wanted to share this insight. I can't tell you the number of times I thought to myself, what is wrong with me? Like, why do I have these patterns? Why do I keep like, I didn't call it self-abandoning at the time, but like, why do my boundaries suck? Why do I keep attracting these relationships? Um, why do I keep having the same experience over and over? And everything about people pleasing was tied to childhood trauma. And it just didn't resonate with me. That wasn't my experience of my childhood. So learning about the systems of oppression really helped me sort of slide that into place where my people pleasing and my poor boundaries and my lack of self worth, where that all came from. And so that's when I started to dive right back into writing my book. And I started writing about the narrow definition of trauma and how trauma is energy and how energy gets trapped in the body. I started to gather information from my mom about her childhood, and I started writing about generational trauma. So all of these things, happened after that big spiritual awakening. And at the same time is when I started my online platform. I started to speak about abuse and I was sharing my lived experience of emotional abuse online. Now, in around October of 2024, I had what I would call another awakening, another big awakening. I was noticing that abuse and abuse content was no longer resonating with me because I was diving deeper into, my subconscious and understanding the shadow and all of those things. Abuse no longer resonated with me, but spirituality wasn't fully integrated. And so I was trying to figure out what to do with my online platform. Like I kept getting these intuitive messages that I needed to shift out of abuse because I was starting to feel uncomfortable talking about it. And I needed to speak more about higher consciousness, spirituality. I was deeply, deeply afraid that by doing that, by making that shift, I was going to lose my audience. And truthfully, I did. Like I've spoken about this many times. When I shifted out of abuse and narcissism and I started talking about self responsibility and our subconscious beliefs and all of these things, I started to get a lot of pushback from my online platform. A lot of people started telling me that I was victim blaming, that I was a covert narcissist. Like it was crazy. It was crazy. But I also at the same time understood because I had been in that same nervous system state before. And so I understood exactly where they were coming from. I also understood that I could not abandon my truth. Had I stayed in that abuse space, I would be self-abandoning because I would be speaking about things that no longer I didn't believe anymore, right? Like when I really dug into all of these things as I continued to expand my consciousness, the whole concept of abuse just didn't resonate anymore because I could see how my fear-based beliefs were contributing to that relational dynamic. And that doesn't mean that I was to blame, because blame from my current perspective doesn't exist, but it means that I participated. And if I didn't want to have those experiences, I needed to change, how I was showing up. So, spirituality was the catalyst. Like my spiritual awakening was the catalyst for all of this shift in consciousness. And so what I wanted to do was to create sort of like a beginner guide to understanding the chakras, because the chakras at the time were helping me witness all of the ways in which I self-abandon. And so I thought I would build this introduction chakra guide as a new product that I could offer my audience. And as I was building out this guide, two things happened. First, I realized that I needed to provide examples. What a balanced root chakra looks, sounds, and feels like versus what an imbalanced root chakra looks, sounds, and feel like. So I wanted to pull from my own life to give examples because this is what I did on my TikTok account. This is what I did when I was in the abuse space. I was, giving examples from my own lived experience. And that is what people resonated with because they were able to say, oh, yeah, I've had the same thing. So they're able to integrate, what I was speaking about. So giving examples became important. When I made the realization that I needed to find examples, I thought to myself, this should be my book. My book needs to be about a memoir about my path from self-abandonment to self-trust. And I'm going to use the chakra system as a guide. And I'm going to show, mind, body, soul alignment and how all of that is the solution to self-abandonment. So obviously my book shifted. I went from a guide to my book, Permission to Be. I was combining the two of them together. So as I was moving through the book and looking for my personal examples and writing about the chakra system, I recognized once again that I was trying to write about something that I had not integrated, especially when it came to the higher chakras. I hadn't embodied them yet. I hadn't integrated the lessons of those chakras. I was still self-abandoning. So I had to put the book up. Over the next year and a half, I made a commitment to myself to really witness all of the ways I self-abandon, to really unpack the faulty beliefs that still existed. And my God, that year was a brutal year. I moved through, fear of abandonment, all of my attachment abandonment issues, to fear of being seen fully, to expressing the truth, my truth, fear of being perceived incorrectly, to this illusion of separation, all of the things. There were so many things that I moved through. Healing my sacral, like there were so many things that I moved through in that year. But it took me looking at every single uncomfortable feeling and identifying where I was self-abandoning in order to experience this feeling. I had to learn how to embody the concepts I was teaching before I could actually teach them. This is integrity. This, from my perspective, is what integrity is. What I eventually recognized in the whole path is it all boils down to your nervous system being able to hold uncertainty, discomfort. That self-abandonment really starts with how we abandon ourselves during uncomfortable moments. How, when I get triggered, am I looking at myself? Am I looking at what part of me is asking for my attention? Or am I blaming other people? Am I pointing the finger outward? This last year has been exponential in terms of my growth. Like when I look back at the decades of therapy and CBT work that I did, and even after doing all of that work, I was still self-abandoning. I was still over-functioning and putting other people ahead of myself. I wasn't breaking any patterns. It took understanding spirituality and having a spiritual awakening and understanding energy for me to be able to shift the lens that I was seeing all of my patterns through to one of self-responsibility, to one of self-referencing. Self-referencing is a big one. It is through that internal shift that I was able to learn how to hold space for every uncomfortable feeling that I had so that I could find the lesson and integrate it. Permission to be is my lived experience of moving from self-abandonment to self-trust. And I am hoping that in the pages, you will be able to recognize the people reading, will be able to recognize themselves, will be able to maybe feel relief, maybe feel confronted and take it as an invitation to go deeper. But this was a wild journey. And I'm grateful. I'm honestly grateful for every experience along the way, even all of my relationships that could be perceived as negative. They all turned out to be a positive experience because of where I am now. And so I do not regret any choice that I ever made. I'm exactly where I need to be. And if you're on this journey right now and you're feeling frustrated and overwhelmed and you're not sure about what comes next, I just want to assure you that you are exactly where you're supposed to be. Everything is connected. Everything is tied together. And you will break out of those patterns when you're ready to see things differently, because the way that you're seeing them is no longer working for you. And I think this is the difference between cognitively understanding your trauma and your patterns and full embodiment. So Permission to Be is out on Amazon. You can order a copy through Amazon, paperback or ebook. If you are interested in a signed copy, I have a limited number that I'm offering through my Stan store. So this is my story, and I hope that it resonates with you. Thank you for being with me for the last 2 years. Thank you for being on this journey with me. Until next time.